Welcome to the video for the study guide answers to Genesis 12 through 19. According to many scholars, chapter 12 of Genesis approaches scripture from a more historical perspective. How do they determine this? First off, just the genre seems to have shifted some in the way of the writing to a more historical way, and that would be taking into account how other historical ancient texts were written as well. Another reason is that the magisterium of the church has taught that chapter 12 on is historical, that the call of Abram really happened, and the events afterwards happened as well. And then a third way of kind of maybe in a way more proving it is just that a lot of these events, there's other evidence outside of the Bible to back them up. So those would be the reasons that it's considered more historical. After receiving land from God, what was Abram's first action, and what is the significance of this? The first action of Abrams is to build an altar to God in a form of thanksgiving. And that's the significance of it, that he's building an altar, that he really cares about his relationship with God, and he understands that it's because of God that he's going to be getting this land. In what way does Abram's experience in Egypt prefigure the story of Exodus? I pointed this out in a video lecture. There's several things that prefigure it. One, Sarai is like a slave, just like the Israelite people will be slaves in the Exodus story. And then God intercedes in both instances and puts plagues on the Pharaoh. And because of that intercession on God's part, Abram and Sarai and then the Israel people are allowed to leave, but they gain wealth as they leave. When Abram told Sarai to say she was his sister, was he lying? Technically, no, because Abram's brother was the father of Sarai. So technically, she was, in Hebrew tradition, she was his sister. So no, he was not lying. Is it ever okay to lie? This is a tough question to answer. There's some theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, who would say that no, it's never okay to lie. And I would say, for the most part, I agree that it's never okay to lie, in that even something that seems a little white lie or something, we don't really know the repercussions of it or how it affects someone else, maybe even further down the line. Although I think from a practical standpoint, it's hard to not lie. If your wife says to you, how does this dress look, or how do I look, sometimes it's better just to say maybe a little bit of a lie, a white lie, and say, yeah, you look great, than maybe tell the truth. But for the most part, I would say no, it's not okay to lie. And if we look at the Catholic Church and their viewpoint on it in the Catechism, it does talk about different levels of lying. Like some lies, like the one I just mentioned with the wife, that would be considered more of a venial sin. So lying in itself can be a sin, but the more mortal sin lies are ones that affect people in more adverse ways. So I'd say no, it's never okay to lie, although I think practically as a human being, it's hard not to lie from time to time, but best to try to curtail your lying as much as possible. Abram and Sarai leave Egypt unharmed. Is it acceptable to do something wrong if the result is good? The wrong that Abram and Sarai did was being deceptive to Pharaoh, and then Pharaoh ended up getting plagues and things like that. Something bad happened to Pharaoh because of their deception, although they got something good out of it, which was they got wealth. In a general sense, though, I would say it is never right to do something wrong or evil, even if you think a good is going to result in it. And I think that's a pretty strong teaching throughout the history of the church, that it's never okay to do an evil, even if something good's going to happen out of it. It's possible that going to Egypt had unintended negative effects on Abram and Sarai. In hindsight, how might they regret their actions in Egypt? If we're looking at it from a modern perspective, obviously the relationship that Sarai had with Pharaoh would lead to maybe distrust and could put a splinter in their relationship. And I would say, in God's eyes, that would be the same thought. That's why God created man and wife to cling to each other and become one flesh, because God was against these sort of interactions. In terms of this story, though, I'm not sure it really had any negative effects, because we see a little bit further in the story that now Sarai does the same thing for Abram, giving him her slave or servant so that they can have a child together. So it seems like in these times that those kind of extra sexual relationships weren't as big of a deal as they are now in more modern times between married couples. Lot's decision to choose what appeared to be the better land turned out to be a terrible mistake. What does this say about making important decisions? Well, maybe what looks like a good decision on the surface really isn't. Lot saw this nice looking land and he just thought, well, it must be good, so I will just head there. And maybe he didn't take enough time to think through his decision. So I think it's very important to think through decisions before you make them, research them. But also another really important point is to pray to God to help you make the right decision. On what do you base your decisions? First and foremost, I base my decisions on how will this affect my relationship with God. If it's something that's going to draw me farther from God, then I won't do it. If I feel like it'll draw me closer to God, then I'll do it. For decisions that are more minor, maybe like purchasing something, I think just researching it, getting several options available to you, I think that's the best way of handling that. So praying, researching, and then just using my conscience to decide if this is a good option for me. Do you ask for God's help when making important decisions? As I just mentioned, yes, by praying, you're asking for God's help in making these important decisions. If you ask God, how do you ask Him? Quite simply, just praying and saying that, God, will your will be done in whatever the decision is? And then whatever the outcome is of that decision, that I handle it in the way that God would want me to handle it. Do you hold God responsible when something negative occurs in your life? I think anyone being completely honest would say that they have done that, maybe initially, from time to time. And ultimately, like I said about Adam, and I would say this about anything negative that happens in your life, you can always push it back all the way to God. And so, yes, I mean, I think people do that, but I don't think God would want negative things to happen to your life unless it was a way to draw you closer to Him. So maybe if something bad, negative happens in your life, you need to contemplate and think, well, how is this going to draw me closer to God? And it's one of those things you might not understand how that's going to happen while in the situation, but then maybe after the situation's over and you have some time away from it, you can see how that was actually a good for you. So a lot of times these things that we think are negative actually can turn out to be good. How should one correctly handle an unfavorable situation? First off, don't get angry, don't be overly emotional. Anytime that happens, you're probably not going to make a smart decision. But if it's an unfavorable situation, maybe step back, try to figure out either how to get out of it or how to turn it into a favorable situation. And you can do that in the same methods I mentioned earlier, which is praying and then contemplating and then getting out there and researching or figuring out how to change that situation. Who was Melchizedek? Melchizedek is the king of Salem, and he's also a high priest to God Most High. What are the ways in which Melchizedek prefigures Jesus? Two main ways. One, Melchizedek was a king of Jerusalem, and he offered a sacrifice of bread and wine. And then Jesus offered a sacrifice of bread and wine in Jerusalem, and Jesus is the King of Kings. Melchizedek offered bread and wine as a sacrificial offering to God. What does this prefigure? Prefigures the Last Supper and the sacrifice that Jesus offers. And then it also prefigures the Eucharist that we get at Mass every week. What does the tithe that Abraham gave to Melchizedek foreshadow? It might not foreshadow anything, to be quite honest with you, as a one-time thing, but it could foreshadow that many Christian faith denominations expect 10% tithing weekly for your income. What factors influence the amount you donate to the Lord? Well, I think here you have to really contemplate and in your conscience decide what is the right amount for you to give. Personally, I just donate every week right out of my bank account, and I don't even, well, I'm not saying I don't miss it at all, but I don't even think about it. It just gets taken out. And I think that's just good to do as well. Then once you've made the decision, you don't have to constantly be thinking about it. Who might have been the word of the Lord that appeared to Abram in a vision? I would say it was Jesus. Jesus is often called in the Gospel of John the Word. So it just makes sense that this would be a manifestation of Jesus from the Trinity in the Old Testament. Now, it wouldn't be Jesus incarnate because that hadn't happened at this point. What was God's first covenant with Abram? His first covenant with Abram was to give him a great nation. And in order to do that, you would need a multitude of people, and then you'd need land. If you had one and not the other, that won't make a great nation. With land, that's just land. You need a lot of people in order for it to become a nation. When God told Abram his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, he believed. Do you believe God has a plan for your life? If so, what is his plan for you? Yes, I think God has a plan for everyone's life, and sometimes we fight that plan. But I think it's important to just realize that really God is at control of our life, and you might not be currently doing what God has ultimately planned for you, but that what you're doing right now is leading up to the point that when you are finally doing what God wants you to do, you'll be ready and prepared and trained to be able to do that. And I would say for me, that's with what I'm doing right now in my life, this is what God's plan is for me. What factors do you think prevent people from fully trusting in God? Quite simply, we always have doubt as humans due to our fallen nature. So I think we have trust issues in general. And so just like we have trust issues with humans, we're also going to have trust issues with God. And if there is any little doubt in your mind that God exists, and I think for a lot of people that is the case, then that is a little bit of a block there too to fully trusting and just allowing God to steer your life in the way that it should be going. Abraham seemed skeptical that God would grant him the land and request a sign. Is it acceptable for us to request a sign from God as Abram did? Yes. If it wasn't acceptable, then God wouldn't give any signs to anyone. And when we look at what we have in the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, there are always signs which each one. We look at baptism, it uses water. So in all sacraments, in a lot of ways, it's good to get a sign because we live in a materialistic world, and signs are good ways to just give us that one more degree of belief, in that we see a sign, feel a sign, whatever it is, that yes, that's more likely to be true than when you can have a sign like that. What kind of sign from God would you like to receive? I've already received several signs and I acknowledge them. I don't know if there's a bigger one that I would need, and I don't even know if I got a bigger one. Like, let's say Mary appeared to me as an apparition. Would that make me believe any more? Probably not, in that no matter what the sign is, you can always be skeptical of it and think, did that really happen? So I'm not convinced that any other sign would help. I don't think it would help for most people. Even if God in the sky tonight wrote in the sky in the stars, I am God, I really exist, you would still get skeptics who would say, well, no, that's not real. So I'm not convinced that signs are that important, but I definitely think it can help and give some comfort to us to receive a sign from God. And really, what's also important is to understand that a lot of times signs are subtle, but you need to acknowledge them. And if it's God asking you to act on something through a sign, that you really should act on it. Could you explain the significance of dividing the sacrificial animals in two? The main reason that was done is that was what was done in most covenant making in the Near Eastern ancient times. And the significance was that by cutting them in half, the individuals would walk in between the halves, basically saying that if I break this covenant, I will end up dead like these animals. What was the reason for Abram not cutting the birds? Most likely they weren't cut because they were going to be used not in the covenant, but separately as a burnt offering to the Lord after the covenant was completed. God informed Abram that his descendants would suffer for 400 years before receiving great possessions. Why is achieving something more rewarding when hardships are involved? The easy answer is that you appreciate it more. If you have to fight, work hard, suffer for something, you just appreciate it more once you actually get it. If you're just handed something, there's not really a reason to appreciate it. You won't appreciate it near as much as if it's something that you had to work hard for. Sarai's impatience with God grows as she remains childless. Is God responsible for an individual's inability to conceive a child? No, God's not responsible that someone can't conceive a child. We see time and time again in the Bible that God can open up a woman's womb, right? to allow her to conceive a child that otherwise she wouldn't. So God can act in those miraculous ways, but most of the time God just lets nature play out, and then he does his part at conception of putting a soul into that new human person. But no, God isn't responsible if someone doesn't have a child. The irony of life is that those who don't want a child can sometimes have one, while those who desire a child may not. What is your belief in why God permits this to happen? Like I said in the previous question, it's just God allowing nature to play its course. Another reason, too, could just be that maybe even not with this child that's born, but maybe somewhere along the line of that child being born, something great happens to one of the descendants. So we don't really know why God allows some people who really want children to not have them, and others who don't too. But there is a plan and a reason behind it, and maybe we just have to wait until we meet our maker and we get filled in on why everything happened as it did. How have you shown impatience towards God? Being a very impatient person, I just always think to myself, God, why is this taking so long? Why did it take so long for me to get where I'm at? And, part of that's my own fault, right? In that you have to allow things to build and take time to get to where they need to get. But I'm a person who really likes things to just happen now. So a lot of times I just question God in that respect. Like, why? Let's have this go. Come on, let's get a move on here. But everything's done in God's time, and we have to understand that. What is the biggest consequence of Sarai taking things into her own hands instead of trusting in God's promise to Abram? First off, we don't know if she even knew about God's plan. Abram might not have even said anything to her. So in some ways, maybe Sarai didn't do anything wrong in that respect. It was Abram's fault for not saying that God said eventually you're going to have a child. But beyond that element of it, just being impatient and not letting things play out in the way God would want them to play out. We have to understand that things happen when they do for reasons. So we just have to trust in God. I would say that's the biggest issue that Sarai had. And the biggest consequence of it was just look at the strife that was created because of bringing Hagar into the picture. Abram and Sarai used an archaic form of reproductive technology by acquiring a second wife for Abram to produce offspring. Nowadays, childless couples are presented with an array of methods to have a child. List some of the methods and explain if they are morally acceptable or not. Well, anything that goes against the natural way pregnancy happens would be considered immoral from a Catholic perspective. So in vitro fertilization would be considered immoral for several factors, but probably the one that stands out the most is that normally multiple embryos are fertilized and then only one or two of them implant. So you're basically killing 6, 7, 8 persons to allow one or two to survive. And like we talked about previously, it's never good to do an evil act, even if something good's going to come out of it. Now, methods that are acceptable are things like monitoring your temperature, trying to figure out when you're ovulating, and things like that. That would be acceptable for them. And I think I'll probably one day do a whole lecture on this topic itself, but I'm just going to leave it at that 2 examples for now. What might have caused Hagar to regard Sarai with contempt? Quite simply, just human nature and the thought that, hey, look at me, I'm pregnant, I've been blessed by God and you haven't. So Hagar was thinking that she had a higher standing in God's eyes, thus she should have a higher standing in the hierarchy of Abram's family. Have you ever looked down upon someone with contempt? What led you to do this? Well, of course, I mean, everyone has. It could just be a simple case of somebody that you don't like that much, and they're coming around you, and you're just looking at them like contempt, like, get away from me. And that's just human nature to do that kind of thing. I think it's very important when you feel that kind of sensation, feeling coming on, that you quickly try to dissipate it so that worse things don't happen. But yes, of course, everyone has looked on a certain number of people with contempt. What does God sending an angel to comfort Hagar say about God and his mercy? It just shows that God is merciful, and that because Ishmael is going to be a son of Abram, that he's still going to get some benefit for that. But I think God sends comfort to anyone in distress, and it might not be quite as obvious as it is in this situation, but God is always there for everyone who's in distress, and he's always showing his mercy to everyone. It's just on you to find out in what way he's showing that to you. Have you ever received mercy from God? If yes, how does God's mercy affect you personally? Yes, I've received God's mercy. I think everyone has. Just being born is a mercy there on us versus not being born. But just understanding that when I mess up or I'm in a bad situation, God will be there for me, and he's a loving father. Just like my father on earth would comfort me and show mercy on me, the ultimate God of everyone in heaven will do the same for us. And how it affects me is it just gives me a calmness to go about life, knowing that God will always have mercy on me. And also, that doesn't give me free reign just to do bad things all the time expecting God's mercy, because I don't. And I think that's a really key point here, is I don't expect his mercy, but when I get it, I really appreciate it and I'm thankful for getting it. And because I know that he's always going to give it to me, I actually don't want to disappoint and get into too many situations where that mercy needs to be shown on me. The Lord's angel prophesies Ishmael will be a wild ass of a man. What does this mean? It just means that Ishmael and his descendants are going to be enemies of Isaac and his descendants. Is Ishmael's ability to be good predetermined by God, making it impossible for him to behave well? God's prophecy given through the angel to Hagar about Ishmael's demeanor and how he would act doesn't really have any bearing on how he actually will act. No, God didn't predetermine per se that Ishmael would act this way. But remember, God is outside of space and time, so God already knows how Ishmael is going to act. And this is just a warning that he's going to act this way. Maybe if Hagar would have taken that seriously, you could say that she could have used that as a means to change Ishmael and not have him end up that way. When faced with hostility, it's common to respond with hostility. In these situations, how would God want us to respond? I think the best way that we should respond is when Jesus says, someone slaps you on your left cheek, turn and let them slap the right. I don't think he physically means turn the cheek and let them hit you again. I think what he's really saying there is that they're coming at you with hostility or with anger. Turn the other cheek and you act the opposite to them. And a lot of times that will deflect or put out that hostility. It just seems like a hostile situation. If the other person acts hostile back, it just makes it even worse. So it takes one person to finally relent and stop acting that way, to stop the situation from being hostile. So why not just let that be you and stop the situation from really getting worse and even more hostile? What are some ways to handle a hostile situation better? Like I already mentioned, just be the better person. Don't get hostile yourself. Don't react in a negative manner. React in a positive manner. And I think you'd find just doing that is enough to make the situation better. What does God promise Abram in the second covenant, and why is it significant? He promises a great name for Abram. And the significance of that is just that Abram will be remembered forever. And we see that because Abram's considered really the forefather of the Jewish people. He has a significant name to Muslims who believe that Ishmael is a descendant of all Muslims. And then as Christians, of course, we look at Abram as the forefather of our religion as well. So you can see that there is a significance of a great name there through this covenant. What is the sign of the second covenant with Abram? The second sign is circumcision. So the first sign was the cutting of animals and the spilling of blood of animals. The second covenant is much more intimate in that it's a cutting of the flesh of Abram and all his descendants and blood coming from them. Why are signs an important part of covenants? Signs are important because it's a way to help people to see that and remember that these covenants are still there. So they're visual, sometimes more than just visual representations of the covenant. And since we live in that materialistic world, it's good for us to get visual signs. That way we can understand that covenant just slightly better. The more of our senses we're using, the more we understand something better. So signs are good for that. It helps us to remember that there's a covenant, but then also maybe understand it better. Who is required to undergo circumcision after the covenant between God and Abraham is established? All of Abraham's descendants, and that would include any of his slaves, as in ancient Near Eastern times, slaves and servants were considered part of the family. So every male heir and descendant from Abraham would need to undergo circumcision. In the new covenant instituted by Jesus, what takes the place of circumcision? Baptism replaces circumcision in the new covenant. So from that point forward, men technically didn't need to be circumcised, they just needed to be baptized. And we see there was a debate in Acts over this, because it must have been maybe Jesus wasn't totally clear on this. So we see in the Acts of the Apostle the debate amongst if Gentiles needed to get circumcised or not, or if baptism and then belief in Jesus was enough. And I also think that this is pointing to the fact that things weren't known during the time of Jesus. So even outside of the Bible and years after, that some of these important questions would still need to be discussed and figured out, of course guided by the Holy Spirit. But that's one reason why sola scriptura, or the belief in the Bible alone, is slightly flawed, in that everything isn't explicitly laid out within the Bible. So people needed to get together and then with the help of the Holy Spirit figure out and interpret things beyond what is said in the Bible. What does the name Abram mean? Abram means exalted father. Can you explain the significance of a name change in the Bible? God changing your name in the Bible meant that your new name would more align you to what his plan for you was. What does Abraham mean? Abraham means father of multitudes. What does Sarah mean? Sarah means princess. What do the three angels that Abraham encountered symbolize? Some people say that it is a manifestation of the Trinity, and it could symbolize that. But more than anything, I think it symbolizes, once again, God's closeness and desire to be close to his creation. Why does Abraham worship just one of them? Because only one of them was God. The other two were angels, and Abraham recognizes that. God told Sarah she would have a child, but she laughed in disbelief. How does Mary's reaction to the angel Gabriel differ from Sarah's upon receiving the same information? Well, Mary didn't laugh, first off. And secondly, she just wanted to know, how is this going to be done? And it's really interesting when you differentiate between the two. And like, Sarah obviously was having sexual relations with her husband, so that's the way to have a child. Yes, she was old, but she was going about the means to have a child. Whereas Mary was a virgin, and she knew that she was going to be a virgin her whole life. She had consecrated herself to God, but she would have been old enough to understand that you need to be with a man in order to have a child. So she's just wondering, okay, God, that's cool, but how's it going to be done? Abraham appears to question God's judgment and seeks to negotiate with him. Have you ever questioned the judgment of God? If so, what did you question? I wouldn't say I've ever questioned his judgment. Now, some of his decisions for my life, maybe I have a little bit, but that only goes so far, in that I realize that ultimately it's my choices that decide where I am at in life. So I think we all initially can question that, especially if you have given your life completely to God and you really are letting him steer your life in the way that he wants it to go. But I've also found that ever since I've started doing that, that I really haven't had anything majorly bad happen. So I really haven't had to question God's judgment, because things have been going really well for me ever since I've completely trusted in God. That doesn't mean bad things don't happen, but now I understand that, yes, something bad might be happening, but God, he has my back, so I'll get through this and be a better person for it. So I don't need to question his judgment. I just maybe need to question, okay, but how am I going to get out of this situation? Similarly to what Mary was doing in the last question, she wasn't questioning how, she's just questioning, okay, what are the steps I need to take now to make this happen? From God's agreeing to Abraham's request, what can we infer from him? I would say we can infer that he's merciful and that he would save everyone if only 10 were righteous. But I also don't think that God was changing his mind here. It infers that maybe in the Bible in the way it's worded, but remember, God never changes his mind. He's all-knowing. But the point is that God is merciful from this more than anything else. Does God ever change his mind? As I was just talking about in the last question, no. God will never change his mind. He knows everything that's going to happen, everything that has happened. That's one thing, a grace that he gave to all the angels too, was the ability to have full knowledge of any decision they would make. For us, we have to change our mind from time to time because we have very limited knowledge of what might happen by making this choice. So that's why it's okay for us to change our mind, because maybe once we start doing something, we realize, no, I really shouldn't be doing this, so we change our mind. Whereas for God and the angels, they have full knowledge of any kind of decision they would make, so they will never change their mind having that full knowledge. Why do you think Lot was waiting at the gates of Sodom? I think he was just hanging out with the crowd, and that would have been a gathering area for people. Maybe he was even partaking in some of these bad, negative things that God was going to bring his two angels to the city to destroy. But he was probably just there hanging out and then noticed two men coming up. What prompted Lot to bow to the two visitors? Just hospitality. That was a custom of the ancient Near Eastern times. It had nothing to do with him worshiping these two men. He would have had no clue at this time that they were anything but just regular men. Why did the mob gather around Lot's house? They really wanted to have sex with the men. It's quite as simple as that. They wanted to rape the men that were in the house, the new strangers. Why did Lot offer his two daughters to the strangers surrounding the house instead of giving over the two men? I would say he did it mainly for the fact that he was being hospitable to the strangers, and also daughters, women were of a little bit lower stature, and it could also just be the nature of that sin would have been grave and also unnatural. So even though the sin of raping his two daughters would have been grave, it still would have been more natural. And I know that's a harsh thing to say, but that is the truth. Would you have done the same if you were Lot? Now, this is a tough question to answer, and I don't really know what the correct answer would be, to be honest with you. If you had a strong conviction like Lot must have had, maybe, but I would say on the surface, no. I don't know anyone who in today's day and age would offer up their daughters to get raped. It just goes against what we as humans would think to do. Why would God want the two men to destroy Sodom? Mainly because of all the grave depravity that was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. And God even mentions it himself. So that was the reason. What caused Lot to linger in Sodom instead of evacuating immediately? Could be he didn't really believe what the angels were saying or didn't take them as very serious. Could have also been that maybe Lot was not wanting to leave because he kind of liked the activities that was going on there, or even that he didn't want to leave all the materialistic wealth that he might have acquired while living there. In what ways did God's destruction of Sodom differ from the Great Flood? This one was an immediate destruction. It wouldn't have taken but a few minutes to destroy, whereas the flood took a long time. So here, God wasn't even allowing the people time to repent and maybe save their souls. So maybe the depravity of the sins that were going on were so great that God knew their souls were beyond redeeming. Whereas for the flood, even though they were great, maybe God felt if these people have time to think about what they did and they knew the impending death that was coming on them, that they would repent and maybe could be saved. Why do you think God chose the quicker method to destroy Sodom? Well, for the same reasons I just mentioned in the last question, that maybe the sins were so grave that there was no coming back from those sins, and God knew it, knew they wouldn't repent, so just destroying the city quickly. Another reason, too, though, is that maybe God was doing it as a warning to surrounding other communities, that they could see the method that he was destroying it with this fire and things of that. It would have been a great spectacle seen for probably hundreds of miles away. And he might have been warning these other people that if you can go down the same path that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah have, this is how you're going to end up. Because obviously word would have gotten around to the neighboring communities of how these people were acting. Why do you think Lot's wife looked back? Maybe she just wanted to look at the spectacle that was happening, right? But maybe also she was lamenting what she was leaving behind. Some people can't move on from the past. How does this affect their present life? If you're constantly living in the past, you're not really paying attention to what's going on now at this moment. And so I don't think you're living as full of a life. It's easy to look back on the past and either glorify it and think of things being better than they were. You hear people all the time saying, oh, back in the good old days, right? I have a feeling it wasn't as great as they think it was. So, we have, as humans, we do tend to kind of only remember the good things of our past. But secondly, we can dwell on the bad things as well. We'll remember those as well, the good and the bad, and then kind of the boring stuff we don't remember, of course. But if you're dwelling on the bad things you do, that is also not letting you live in the present to its fullest. So we shouldn't really look back too much on the past, or at least not dwell on it, because it can hurt us in the life we're living right now. What was Lot's daughter's rationale for laying with their father? Most likely it's because they thought that the whole world had been destroyed and that their father was the only male human left. Or it could have been that they weren't near any younger men and were getting older and knew this was the only chance they had to have children, and that their whole family line had been destroyed. And that was a bad thing in Near Eastern times because it would mean that you were wiped out from history. Do you think this act was immoral? Yes, it was immoral for the simple fact that Lot's daughters didn't ask his permission, and in a way they kind of raped him. It would have been moral, though, if they would have asked his permission, because just like with Adam and Eve, if you take that story literally, that they were the first two humans, their children would have had to marry each other, and there would have been a close family relationship having sexual relations in order to populate the species. That would have been happening here if Lot's daughters would have asked Lot and they thought they were the only humans left. What might have absolved Lot's daughters of any wrongdoing in this situation? Quite simply, just ask their father permission and getting him to agree to the act. How is the drunkenness of Lot similar to the drunkenness of Noah? Well, because of a drunken act, they were violated, and then the offspring of that violation ended up becoming enemies of the Israel people later on. What negative consequences arise from this event? I already addressed this in the last slide, but the Ammonites and the Moabites are the descendants of these two relationships that Lot had with his daughter. And we see later in the Bible that they were enemies of the people of Israel. That's it for the Study Guide Answers for Session 5. I'd like to thank you for watching the video and look forward to the next video. Bye.